There's a scene in Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid where they are trying to get employment down in Bolivia, and they're asked to show their shooting skill, and Butch misses all of his shots, and then he asks, "Can I move?" And the guy says yes, and he proceeds to, of course, hit his target every time. So I need to move, and that's why I'm up here, not sitting with my colleagues. While this paper may seem unnecessary to many in the audience, there are actually scholars coming to Poteet directly now without having gone through Polani first. And yet, Polani is essential for appreciating a major portion of Bill's thought, as Polanian Meditations makes clear. So this will be a primer for some and a refresher for some of the more mature scholars present. My aim is to highlight features of Polani's story relevant to Poteet's story. Michael Polani was born in Budapest in 1891 to a large, non-practicing Jewish family, which was relatively wealthy during his childhood. He grew up fluent in German, French, English, and Hungarian, and had a broad classical education. He completed his medical training, served as a doctor in World War I, and served briefly in the government after the war. But his interest shifted to physical chemistry, in which he received his PhD in 1919. What strikes one about Polani's background is the cultural richness of the Central European humanism shared by assimilated Jews prior to World War II, giving him an acute intelligence and very high standards. He could read Latin and Greek as an adolescent. He read widely in the literature of 4 languages and had a lifelong interest in politics and social issues. Among his friends and acquaintances were Karl Mannheim, Georges Lukács, Alfred Koestler, and of course his brother Karl. His first scientific paper was published at 19. A second paper employing the new quantum mechanics received a very positive evaluation from Albert Einstein, to whom it had been sent before its publication. At the age of 23, he was first offered a position in the Kaiser Wilhelm Gesellschaft in Berlin, which he had to decline because of his military service. Beyond the extraordinary character of this early training and environment, Michael Polani also had a deep sense of responsibility for Western society, such that his later move from science to philosophy seemed natural to him. During his 10 years as a member of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Physical Chemistry in Berlin, his research focused mainly on 3 areas: adsorption of gases on solids, X-ray structure analysis of the properties of solids, and the rate of chemical reactions. And it was here that his international reputation in science was established, and here that he saw what would always remain a model of intellectual community. It was also in this period that Polani had the first experience that was lead him eventually to the writing of personal knowledge. Both while in Germany and after moving to the University of Manchester when Hitler came to power, Polani had traveled to the Soviet Union several times to academic conferences, and in 1938 he had a conversation about the social role of science with Nikolai Bukharin, a major theoretician of the Communist Party. Bukharin declared that the belief in pure scientific research was an aberrant result of capitalism, that in the future, Soviet scientists would spontaneously pursue research that would benefit the latest government plan, due to the internal harmony of a communist society. Polani states, quote, "In 1935, I could still smile at this dialectical mystery-mongering, never suspecting how soon it would show terrible consequences," unquote. Polani was not naive about communism. He had read a great deal of Marx, engaged in intense discussions with family members on various aspects of socialism from his youth on. In fact, his sister-in-law, Karl's wife Ilona, had been imprisoned in Vienna for her communist sympathies. Polani had opposed a strong movement in England to place science at the service of society in imitation of the Soviet model. But until Russian biologists began to be imprisoned for declining to practice science in accord with Bukharin's vision and appealed to Western scientists in their defense, Polani did not realize that he had no philosophy of science to support his beliefs. The allegiance of Western intellectuals to philosophical skepticism and their romance with the utopian dreams of communist rhetoric left them unable to respond to the ruthless realities of the Soviet situation. Polani therefore began writing increasingly to respond to this challenge, becoming more and more interested in the social sciences and philosophy. Quote, "Marxism has challenged me to answer these questions. Like Marxist theory, my account of the nature and justification of science includes the whole life of thought in society," unquote. In 1947, Polani was invited to give the Gifford Lectures that would become Personal Knowledge 10 years later. And in 1948, he finally moved from chemistry to social studies at Manchester. This is the Polani that Bill Poteet first read in 1952, a distinguished scientist who had left his science behind in an effort to respond to the skepticism, reductionism, and determinism of Western thought. Note that these men come to a similar problem from very different directions. Poteet from a study of French philosophy of the 17th century, namely Pascal and Descartes, and Polani from a response to critical political problems of the 20th century, namely the challenge of Soviet Marxist-Leninism. In a very real sense, Poteet had identified a problem in Western thought that would later produce the phenomenon that Polani confronted, militant Marxism. That there are wide differences between these men is not surprising, given this history. What's remarkable is that Poteet sensed the resonances between them and was able to capitalize on them. So what are the beliefs that Polani articulated in answer to the challenges of his day? Before looking at Poteet's own answer to this question, let's note some characteristic features of Polani's work. First, he sees scientific knowledge as paradigmatic for all forms of knowing. Though a critic of certain of its forms, though he sees similar processes operating in all forms of knowledge, Polani remains a firm believer in the greatness of science. Quote, "Nothing is more certain in our world than the established results of science," unquote. Two, he emphasizes the practical activity of scientists doing their research, and his books are replete with such examples. This means a focus on the process of discovery rather than on the ultimate codification of discoveries in formal theoretical results. This is a feature of his work that is unavailable to non-scientists like Popper or Kuhn or Verhaben or others. Mary Jo Nye's recent book about Polani shows this feature clearly. Third, he sees the history of science as an important guide to the nature of scientific activity and uses these examples frequently, de-emphasizing efforts to formalize the scientific method. We might summarize these last 2 points by saying Polani emphasizes the situatedness of knowledge within the person and within society. Fourth, Polani can be described as a realist, I would say a critical realist in his views on the external world. Quote, "We can account for this capacity of ours to know more than we can tell if we believe in the presence of an external reality with which we can establish contact. This I do. I declare myself committed to the belief in an external reality gradually accessible to knowing, and I regard all true understanding as an intimation of such a reality, which, being real, may yet reveal itself to our deepened understanding in unexpected manifestations," unquote. We never completely grasp or understand this reality. It remains to some degree hidden and continually surprises us, but we do actually make contact with it, as the progress of science shows. Newton's confirmation of Copernicus's theory of heliocentrism came 144 years after the theory was published, thus affirming the reality and power of human knowing. Fifth, another characteristic of Polani is that he traces knowing back into its pre-articulate roots, establishing a continuum in knowing that accredits the reality of evolution without surrendering the distinctiveness of human achievement. The behavior of apes, rats, chickens, and infants becomes relevant in Polani's mind to such questions as, how is it that we can apprehend order and patterns in the world? How can we acquire a thousand-fold multiplication of our cognitive abilities through the use of words? Unquote. Polani here ignores the traditional logic-psychology distinction to reach a comprehensive view of living things figuring out their world. Finally, let me say something about the idea that is most associated with Polani among the general republic of scholars, namely the tacit dimension of knowing. A particularly important ingredient in his thought was supplied by Gestalt psychology, which established the powerful habit of the mind to integrate the various parts of a visual field to a whole, a form or shape having meaning. While the psychologist had interpreted this mechanistically as the internal equilibration of external stimuli, Polani saw it as a clue to how a person intentionally seeks order in the world. Thus, the part-whole elements of Gestalt were reinterpreted by Polani to indicate two kinds of awareness in all knowing: a focal awareness of things immediately before us in vision and consciousness, such that we can describe their particular features, and a subsidiary awareness of various background elements of a situation, which are integrated by the person into the focal object to which he or she is attending. Gestalt psychology was describing the pre-articulate form of human knowing, which in a responsible scientist can be seen as the process of discovery, by which unspecifiable clues are indwelled so that their joint meaning might be perceived through the mind's integrative powers. Through such strategies, Michael Polani reinserted the human person and her history into discussions of science and discussions of knowing with such radical implications that few were able to see the import of personal knowledge. One who did see its import was Bill Poteet, and perhaps an appropriate way of continuing this sketch of Polani is by using Poteet's own list of what he called, quote, the decisive motifs of Polani's thought, those that caused him to wish to and enabled him to mount and sustain a polemic against the critical tradition of the Enlightenment, unquote. Poteet describes this in pages 136 to 46 in Polanian Meditations. Though his specific aim there is to show that Polani's thought is sustained by images that are, quote, at bottom biblical in derivation, unquote, he nevertheless gives us an acute summary of Polani's philosophy. He identifies the personal, knowing as obedience and responsibility, the fiduciary mode of our being mind bodily in the world, our calling, and the inexhaustibility of what is real. First, one reason that Polani's thought put off so many professional academics is that he always speaks out of his own personally centered, self-transcending mind bodily integrity in the world. Poteet's language, unquote.
Nice phrase.
Thanks. I've started talking like that sometimes, which alarms my wife. He avoids the detached objectivist stance of the critical scholar, constantly using metaphors that flow from a personal approach. Quote, the many variant uses of the word personal throughout personal knowledge are therefore governed by the logic of his always personally centered and recursive reflection, unquote. When Polani analyzes the knowing process, he finds that there is always an active agent integrating the tacit clues of a given setting in order to discover their explicit meaning. Knowing is always, therefore, an action, a process, guided by an intelligent agent, the human person. Such personal acts underlie all our knowings, from the most routine to the most abstract and complex. Secondly, as his aim is the justification of scientific knowledge, Polani naturally takes up the question of the import of our personal claims. Quote, "There is a personal participation of the knower in all acts of understanding, but this does not make our understanding subjective. Comprehension is neither an arbitrary act nor a passive experience, but a responsible act claiming universal validity," unquote. And these quotations are from Poteet, describing these elements of Polani's thought. To talk in this way is to make a novel epistemological affirmation, namely that knowing always involves making a personal claim. It is active, not passive. It is reflexive, referring back to the person who makes it, not objective, as if written on an eternal and timeless text. Finally, Poteet notes, responsible acts, indeed any acts, are convivial. Their context is an interpersonal world of others, to whom we are responsive as to other persons, and to whom we are therefore responsible. Knowing, then, is obedient and responsible, unquote. Here, Polani is beginning to ground, to justify the results of scientific knowledge, not in some objective calculus of logic or verification, but in the personal acts of the scientist, a most extraordinary claim according to the critical tradition. Third, quote, Poteet says, "Fiduciary plays a central role in Polani's exposition, and rather than use the more common trust or faith as translations, Poteet renders it to rely upon. Thus, as an existent tonic mind-body, I acritically rely upon the fact of the pre-reflective and unreflected givenness of my being as the ground of reflection," unquote. There are two elements of the fiduciary that need highlighting. First, the kind of natural unconscious reliance on the states and powers of our bodies that goes on continually, as right now. You are relying on your heart pumping, your lungs breathing, your bones and muscles holding you upright, your eyes surveying the scene before you, if you had coffee during the break, your ears taking in the sounds of the room, and so on. Polani again turns a commonplace into an epistemological claim. Because such reliance is a necessary precondition for all knowing, and the richness and complexity of these forms of reliance cannot be fully specified, our knowing is necessarily built upon trust, upon faith. Second, when we consider not the unconscious constituents of knowing, but the articulate claims of reason, another element of reliance can be seen, namely its intentional circular character. Polani begins chapter 10 of Personal Knowledge with the credo, "I believe that in spite of the hazards involved, I am called upon to search for the truth and state my findings." This sentence, summarizing my fiduciary program, conveys an ultimate belief which I find myself holding. In uttering this sentence, I both say that I must commit myself by thought and speech, and I do so at the same time. Any inquiry into our ultimate beliefs can be consistent only if it presupposes its own conclusions, unquote. Thus, our explicit articulated knowings rely upon our tacit knowings. The latter is the ground, the former the consequence. Here is an understanding of logic that places reliance or trust at the heart of human knowledge. Poteet goes further to argue that, quote, "It is not then merely our knowing which has a fiduciary structure, our very being in the world is fiduciary in structure," unquote. At every moment I rely on some antecedent moment, and some logically antecedent level in order simply to live. Fourth, quote, of all the biblical images to be found in Polani's account of our ways of knowing and being, none is more unambiguously or centrally present than that of calling, unquote. To claim knowledge is to have an intellectual commitment, to make a responsible decision to search for the truth and to state one's findings. Important here is the fact that the situation in which I make such a commitment, such a decision, is not some generalizable universal situation, but that which is peculiar to me and my specific history. There is thus a givenness to our situation which frames our decisions. Quote, believing as I do, Polani writes, in the justification of deliberate intellectual commitments, I accept these accidents of my personal existence as the concrete opportunities for exercising our personal responsibility. This acceptance is the sense of my calling, unquote. And as one can only be called in a convivial setting, Polani can say, our believing is conditioned at its source by our belonging, unquote. Finally, in Potit's catalog of central motifs in Polani's thought, we come to his radical redefinition of the real as that which is absolutely contingent, which cannot be comprehended even in principle as that which will continue to reveal itself in surprising, indeterminate future manifestations. Reality is, in fact, inexhaustible, as God is inexhaustible for Potit. If one takes an instrumentalist view of science, as positivists like Ernst Mach did, then scientific claims are merely convenient calculating devices, summaries of experience which are economical and useful, like a telephone dictionary. The persuasive power of scientific theory, its ability to discern some new coherence, to disclose some new reality, is denied, in Mach's view, out of a desire to maintain the certainty of these same theories. The meaningfulness of knowledge, to speak of what is true and real, has been sacrificed to a misplaced obsession with an absolutely certain, explicit, clear method of verifying the real. I've only touched on a few elements of the rich legacy of Michael Polani, but perhaps it's enough to sense the web of connections between Polani and Potit. And to these connections, we now turn. I have a copy of this. You go ahead. Sorry.